Okay, guys, just a couple more, quick things about the church, and then we'll see if some of this maybe helps in terms of understanding that comparison between the Christian church in the West and the Christian church in the East. So there is, a structure to this, and some of the issues that start to develop that maybe will cause some angst, especially with the Byzantine Empire, relate to the power of the Pope. Because the Christian Church in the West is becoming much more dominant as an authority figure, only because the church is kind of filling up a little bit of that power vacuum, there becomes some role for the Pope in particular to have some power that's maybe even at times seemingly greater than some of the monarchs of the day. We see this to some extent maybe in 800 with the crowning of Charlemagne by Pope Leo III, even though some of this is a little bit of a maybe a reward for some of what Charlemagne had done for Leo III. There still is the sense that, it's Leo III that's crowning Charlemagne. It kind of elevates maybe the Pope. One of the figures that's probably most well known for really elevating the power of the Pope is Pope Gregory VII. And this is after the crowning of Charlemagne. And it kind of goes into like the even time period after the schism. It's in 1073. But, we see a lot of ways in which papal power grows, and then just like one or two comments about Gregory VII. So, the power of the Pope, is extensive, because the church is creating kind of canon law. So this body of moral code that people kind of need to follow. There's also the power of excommunication and interdicts, ways that the church, can kind of have some sort of a threat to some degree over people. There's also this huge debate about lay investiture. This has lay is basically means somebody who's not a religious figure, not ordained as a priest, but somebody who's ultimately selecting some of the religious figures. And back in this day, the popes are actually picked by Roman families. In today's day and age, the Roman Catholic Church uses the group of cardinals to actually pick, a member from the group of cardinals to become pope. So the current Roman Catholic pope is Pope Francis. He was picked by cardinals. But back in the Middle Ages, it wasn't uncommon for there to be, picking of various families, and there becomes this debate over who should pick religious figures, especially leading bishops and people that were going to have a great deal of significance over the lives of common people. And lay investiture is all about the kings kind of picking religious figures, and the church is interested in getting some of that power back. The church would like to pick its own figures for its own hierarchy, so develop its own power structure without having those people kind of be political appointments. And regardless of who's doing the picking, there's a great deal of corruption early on. Religious leaders in some cases bought their way in, so they might have actually paid money to become a bishop. They may have, known someone. There's a great deal of corruption, and it takes a while for some of those reforms to actually get established. But Pope Gregory VII, is known in particular for a showdown, essentially, between Gregory VII and Henry IV. And this is just kind of a particular power struggle where Gregory VII essentially threatens to excommunicate Henry IV because he wants to have greater power and be able to pick some of the church figures. And Gregory VII, to some degree, arguably wins. He doesn't excommunicate Henry IV, but Henry IV comes, begging in the middle of the night on a snowy, wintry night, to kind of be submitting to Pope Gregory VII. So there is a lot of kind of who's in the higher power, the Pope, or a secular ruler. And that kind of church and state thing becomes very much connected in the West. In Byzantine, we're going to see a lot of kind of resentment against the Roman Pope, and kind of a lot of questioning about papal authority as it exists in Rome. The structure in Byzantine is that there were many, many kind of patriarchs, one of which was in Rome, one of which was in Antioch, one of which was, there were several of these patriarchs that were kind of seen as equal. And there is not an interest in the Byzantine culture in making the Pope of Rome the highest power. And so there's a lot of question about that. That becomes one of the biggest issues between the Byzantines and the Western Europeans in terms of the church. And just lastly, this just gives you a sense of a breakdown of like maybe what a monk's day would look like. So these monasteries start to attract people, some of whom also are from noble families, may not have been the firstborn son, but are ultimately seeking out kind of a role in society. They may have gone to a monastery, perhaps even seeking some type of higher order, in a religious sense. But the monasteries are especially once reformed. So the Benedictine monks, or some of the other reforms that happen that try to weed out some of the corruption, try to deal with issues such as, heresy, people who are non-Christian and whatnot. But the monasteries become places where monks are really studying, praying, sleeping, working, and that's essentially it. You can kind of see the activities of a monk's day, most of which is either sleeping, working in the middle of the day, meditation, which is blue, and church is everything that's yellow. So there's a great deal of church and reflection. A lot of monks actually took vows of silence, so they were not to be social and speak to others. They also took vows of chastity, so they, were reflective, and in a lot of cases, kind of in a meditative form. There was also a role for the monks in being scribes, and even if monks to some degree were not reading all of the texts, they were actually copying the Latin texts. And we see this under Charlemagne with the Carolingian Renaissance, and it's something that continues as a role for the church. And some of the monasteries, so for example in England or in Ireland, some of the monasteries become centers for literacy, for education, but also for the preservation of texts. And what you see kind of on the screen is an illuminated manuscript, because a lot of people couldn't read. Some of the writing is for those who could read, and then some of the illuminations are images that might help connect some of the main points, right? They're beautiful, they're meant to be very visual, but there's a reason why a lot of visual information is shared, because people aren't necessarily literate. So lots of roles for monks. So kind of have on your look for, if you're doing the Christianity topic, some of the ways in which Byzantine church is going to develop differently than the Western church. Some of it is cultural, so it's based on a language of Greek or exposure to, Greek classical, writers. People like Aristotle or whatever might have been much more exposed, to in Byzantine. There's also perhaps some things that are doctrinal, some disagreements that over the theology, the way in which people believe the Trinity works and things like that. There's also some cultural practices. In the Eastern Roman Empire or Byzantine, we see a practice of priests continuing to be married, as well as serving in a priesthood. In the Western Church, under the canon laws of the Roman Catholic Church, we see priests having to have a vow of celibacy. That's something that Byzantine does not endorse, and one of the reasons why the church splits. Not the biggest reason, but one of the reasons. And certainly the issue of Charlemagne being crowned emperor, and also something known as iconoclasm, which is something that really stems from Byzantine, but is another crisis of church and state. So look into that if that's something that you're working on, is the compare and contrast for Christianity. You can also check out the Byzantine PowerPoints. They should help as well. Okie doke, have a good rest of the day.